How you doing?
I'm doing okay. What about you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for
Okay.
thanks for joining us. Obviously, it's a very important topic that we're going to be discussing today, and
Of course.
and you're a world expert on it. So I'm going to let people log on, and
Sure.
while they're logging on, I'll just do a little introduction about you, if that's okay. And again,
That's
thanks for your
perfect.
time. Obviously, you're super busy.
Thank you.
Um,
Let me just make sure that this is, yes.
so your
This
camera
doesn't
doesn't
fall.
fall down in the
Sorry.
middle of the
I
interview.
had it all ready for the other side. Okay, I'm ready.
Perfect. Perfect. So anyway, so today we'll be talking with Dr. Maria Alcaide. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it Alcaide or
Alcaide is
Alcaide?
fine, yes. Alcaide.
Okay, Alcaide. Perfect. She is a professor of medicine here at the University of Miami. She is director of the ID Research Division. She really is world-renowned expert in vaccine development with NIH funding, and recently has taken center stage in light of the COVID pandemic. With the race for the vaccine, she's been interviewed locally, regionally, and also nationally. She is most importantly leading as the main site for one of the most promising vaccines, which is the Moderna vaccine clinical trial. And we'll be talking about that today. And we'll be talking about what's fact and what's fiction, because obviously there's a lot of stuff that goes on TV. Not sure how much is real and how much is false. So anyway, thanks for joining us, Maria. And look forward to hearing your thoughts. I guess
Thank you so much for having me. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess start by just telling a little bit about how COVID infects human cells.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So that's a great question, and thank you so much for having me. I think the vaccine topic is really something that it's fascinating, and we have more questions than answers for this novel virus, the SARS-CoV-2. So the coronavirus, it's a virus that it's a respiratory virus. So the way it infects cells, it enters through the respiratory secretions, and then it infects cells. It has kind of like the typical viral attack for other respiratory viruses, like the flu. It has an antigen that will enter the cell and then will destroy the cells that get infected. It's respiratory, so it initially happens in the respiratory tract, but we also have learned over time that it can also affect other cells, like for example the GI tract cells, due to the receptors that are there that can also be affected. So even if it's a respiratory virus and mostly would cause respiratory symptoms, it can also cause symptoms related to other organs like diarrhea and vomiting, and then kind of like then it will cause release of cytokines and an inflammatory stage that would lead to having a fever and having the symptoms that we normally see with other viruses, and not just in the respiratory tract.
Now, so as a scientist, when you're working on vaccines, what are your targets? What are your general targets?
So for this virus, there is an antigen, and I will say that what we are leading at the University of Miami is the clinical trial. We are not so involved in the development of the vaccine itself. However, in general, we have to target the viral particles that will allow the virus to enter the cell. So for the vaccine, for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, is typically the protein S, or the spike protein, which is known to be the one that linked to the receptors of the human cells and leads to the virus to enter the cells. Most of the vaccines are targeting the development of antibodies towards that spike protein or protein S, and they do it in different ways, depending on how we want to stimulate the cell that is not infected to develop those antibodies.
Now, what are the steps in developing a vaccine, starting from just the initial concept, then they have to do basic science studies? How much work goes into it before it's first tried on a human being?
There's tremendous work that goes in before it actually goes into the human being. It starts with in vitro assays and then animal studies, and then we go to the typical clinical trial developments, which is phase 1, 2, and 3. the challenge with this SARS-CoV-2 is that it's a new virus. There was little known about, I mean, there was really nothing known about this virus and little known about other very highly pathogenic coronaviruses. The Sars virus and the MERS virus provided a little bit of background that was used to develop vaccines towards SARS-CoV-2. And that's why so rapidly we were able to get a product that could be tested in humans. Phase 1 is typically to detect the dose that will be effective and to also give us some ideas of safety. And that was done very, very rapidly. And then phase 2, it's larger. And then phase 3, which is where we are with the trials that we are leading, like the Moderna, but also other trials around the world. Really, when it makes it to the press and everybody talks about it, it's typically when it's developed in the lab and then when it reaches this phase 3. And phase 3 is really testing efficacy. So it's testing thousands of people, large numbers of people, and one group will get a placebo and the other group will get actually the active product, and then looking at efficacy, how many get infected in each arm.
Got you. How complex is vaccine development for COVID compared to other viruses? Just saying, like the seasonal flu, HIV, which they've tried and never had a vaccine for, Zika. Is it more complex, the same?
I think we don't know yet because we don't know if we have an effective vaccine. What we know is that very rapidly, at least, there are some promising products that are able to develop or to develop a good antibody response. And that's great news. We haven't had that luxury with HIV, for example. It's certainly much more difficult than it is for the flu, because the flu, it's a virus that we know it mutates every year, and we are able to rapidly, we already have a vaccine process in place, and all we do every year is really adapt the previous year to the circulating virus. So for this novel coronavirus, it's been challenging. It's been challenging because we only had 2 viruses that were similar. The common coronavirus that circulates every year is not highly pathogenic, so there was no really it was not meaningful to develop a vaccine for that virus. There was a lot of work years back for MERS and SARS, but those viruses did not spread as fast as SARS-CoV-2. So there was a little bit of background, but it was really that had to be very, very rapid and very challenging, and also trying to use novel methods and novel ways to be able to produce vaccines when they are efficacious, to produce them in a massive way to fight this pandemic.
Got you. So it sounds like you are hopeful for a vaccine, even though it's a challenging virus. You don't see it being like HIV, where we never have a vaccine.
Well, it's a different virus. HIV is a retrovirus, which actually integrates into the cell, and this virus is different. It's a virus that doesn't integrate into the cell genome. And what we have seen so far is that we have at least products that have been well tolerated and are able to develop antibodies. The question is whether those antibodies will be what we call neutralizing antibodies. We've had little success with HIV, with products that will develop neutralizing antibodies. It looks like with this virus, we are closer, and I think the fact that there are so many groups and so many different approaches, the classic approach, which is using inactivated virus, using other vectors like adenoviruses, using proteins, as well as using the RNA. These are all, so I think we are looking at this a different way because we are using different approaches with the same goal. And I'm really hopeful. And as an infectious diseases doctor, we have to be, because that's really the way that we've been able through history to fight pandemics.
So everyone's very hopeful about the Moderna clinical trial, which has gotten a lot of press, probably the most promising clinical trial, at least here in the US. And you're leading the major site. Tell us a little bit about what the clinical trial entails, how the vaccine works, because everyone's very excited to learn more.
Okay, so the Moderna, it's a different vaccine tool. We have a site. There are many sites. It's many sites in the U.S. where one of the sites, Dr. Susan Doblecki, is the site PI, and I work very, very closely with her to get the site up and running and be able to enroll a large number of participants. The Moderna uses a different approach. It uses mRNA, which is kind of like a genetic. It's really mRNA. So part of the gene that will send the signal to develop those antibodies. It's the only trial, is the only product that has that approach, which has been very successful in those preliminary trials. There are over 30 sites in the US, and the hope is to recruit over 30,000 participants. We are one of the main sites. We are recruiting very rapidly. One of the goals of having a site at the University of Miami, it's also to be able to include ethnic minorities who are underrepresented overall in research and really, really vulnerable, and have shown to be those that are mostly affected by the consequences of this virus in the US. So we have that role and are the leads in trying to make sure that underrepresented minorities are part of these clinical trials.
And so people have heard that it's in phase 3, and obviously you know what that means and I know what that means. But for the lay person, kind of describe phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and ultimate FDA approval.
Okay, so phase 1 is, so phase 1 to 4 are the phases where the participants are humans. So it's after the in vitro, after it's happened in the lab, and after it's happened with animals. And then we move to humans. Phase 1, it's really to detect whether there are major toxicity. And then in phase 1, the individual receives different doses to reach the dose that is safe and it's effective. And so there are typically different doses given. And for Moderna, there were 4 different doses, and 1 dose was chosen. And then phase 2 typically happens, especially for these vaccine trials for SARS-CoV-2, it's happening at the same time as phase 1. It's a larger number of participants and kind of having a little bit more information about preliminary efficacy. And now the endpoints for these early trials are phase 1 and 2 are primarily the development of antibodies, because that's how we fight infections. So a virus has an antigen, enters the cell, and then the body creates those antibodies. So if we are able to kind of teach the cells that haven't seen the virus before to develop those antibodies, the hope is that when the virus enters, those cells will be able to develop those antibodies rapidly. So phase 3, so the phase 1 and 2 have shown that those antibodies are being produced and are being produced in almost all the participants. And that's really great news. But now phase 3 is really looking at, are those antibodies really protecting against new infections? So phase 3 is what we call a randomized placebo versus experimental drug. There is half of the participants will be receiving a placebo. When we do trials with pills, we call it a water pill. When we do trials with injections, we just call it a placebo, or a water solution is injected. And then the other half of the group will actually be receiving the vaccine. All participants will be followed over time, and then we'll see how many of those develop the infection. Since we are in the middle of the pandemic, everybody at the moment living in cities where the trial is being done is at risk for getting COVID. So, and the answer will be whether there are more participants in the placebo arm versus the experimental arm that will develop COVID. Other things that are being looked in phase 3 is obviously toxicity at a larger scale, whether things that were not seen when very few number of participants were tested, whether we can see more, as well as tolerability long term, and also participants will be followed for 2 years. So we are now kind of facing the wave 1 of the virus. We know there will be a second wave, or we think and we predict there will be a second wave. So will these antibodies be there, and we'll be able to protect participants from that second wave? So that will be looked at over 2 years.
And then what is phase 4?
Well, phase 4. So after phase 3, then that's when we go to the FDA. That's when we can start requesting approvals. And phase 4, it's actually it's really just after phase 3. If there is efficacy, it will be open to distribution as long as there is FDA approval.
Gotcha.
And phase 4 is kind of open.
Someone wants to enroll in the Moderna clinical trial. They get enrolled. They get randomized to either getting the vaccine versus a placebo, and then over time you guys measure whether or not there are antibodies and whether or not they get infected, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And how do you know if they're exposed at all, or do you not know if they're exposed?
Well, in terms of exposed to the virus, well, the rates of the virus that we are seeing now in the US, we really have to assume that everybody at some moment, especially now that things are opening up, will be exposed. And really the people who are and these are large numbers, right? This is not 4 people, this is thousands of people. So as we enroll, and based on the inclusion criteria, the chances for a group, a participant who is in the placebo versus participants who are in the active arm will really have the same chances of getting exposed.
Correct. Now, just to ask a scientific question, you're talking about humoral immunity in terms of the antibodies. People have mentioned also cellular immunity in terms of T cells. Is that something that you have looked at, or any other vaccines are looking at?
It's something that is being looked at as part of the trials. I think we are learning more and more about that. I think it was just based on humoral and antibody-dependent immunity. We are learning that there is also some immunity that can come from those T cells. I think we will know more about that. It's a little bit too early to know how is that going to play a role in the vaccine response. However, I think we are learning more and more about that.
So if someone listening to this chat wanted to enroll in the trial, how easy is it? What do they need to do?
There is a website where they can get information and also register themselves as potential volunteers, and then somebody will reach out to them. There's also an email, which is Miami COVID vaccine, if I recall well, and I can share with you on Instagram after the talk at miami.edu, and they can also send an email to that number, and then somebody will contact them with all the specifics. And
you're trying to enroll 30,000, is that correct?
30,000 nationally. In Miami, we are planning to enroll 1,000. I will say that enrollment it's going up really, really well at all sites, and there's a lot of people who are participating and getting enrolled in the trial.
Now tell me, what is, looking at the time scale now, what would you predict to be the ETA? I know this is like the $1 million question. The ETA for your Moderna vaccine to be FDA approved and to be available for the public?
I think we are all hoping to have preliminary results based on what a clinical trial is. So once participants start getting the vaccine, they are followed over time. We follow them for adverse effect, adverse events, for toxicity. There is independent boards that look at the safety and make sure that, and depending on what they see by arms, they would allow the trial to continue or not, or stop. And that has happened to other trials. And we very recently heard about the Oxford trial that was held just for a few days because that independent board identified a potential safety issue. So as enrollment happens, the preliminary results in terms of efficacy, we'll have them within 3 months. And then from there, I think there will be a determination of whether that can be moved to FDA approval.
So we're looking at the earliest kind of February, March-ish.
Yeah, we are hoping. Perhaps we'll have some preliminary results before that. But then the good thing about the work that is being done related to this pandemic is that at the same time as the vaccines are being developed, the Moderna as well as other vaccines, there is a lot of work being done in trying to develop the vaccine manufacturing component. After a vaccine shows to be efficacious, then it needs to be distributed. And that distribution needs sites for distributions, needs needles, needs alcohol, needs really a massive amount of products. And we cannot forget that this is happening now at the same time when we are also vaccinating from the flu, which also requires similar supplies. So we're really hoping to have preliminary results by the end of the year, and then very rapidly ramp up to production and distribution as soon as possible.
So
The Moderna trial,
So they are ramping up because obviously, just like you said, distribution is going to be a huge endeavor. Mm-hmm. And they're not waiting for the vaccine to be approved. They're getting ready to have all those hundreds of millions of distribution vials and syringes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is also a plan to use those for whatever vaccine shows efficacy. And is promising. So as all the vaccine sites and all the products are being tested, there's a lot of work being done on once that product that shows efficacy is identified to ramp up the production.
Now, there's obviously many companies working on vaccines here in the US. You mentioned the Oxford vaccine. There was talk about the Russian vaccine. How much collaboration goes on between different countries, various companies, just so people aren't working against each other or they're not reinventing the wheel?
I think the good thing is that each of these vaccines seem to have, they do have different approaches. It is possible, and I think it will be wonderful if all of them shows efficacy, because that way we will have more to offer. But even if it's not, the good thing is that we will have an approach that is valid, and that is unprecedented to have so many candidates at the same time. It is really the hope that those who are safe and effective will show promise as soon as possible, and I think the countries are doing a good job in trying to allow sites as well as really trying to look at the science as the main driver to really select a candidate and use it for broad distribution.
Based off what you've heard, are the foreign vaccine clinical trials promising? It's hard to tell, obviously, because they don't have the FDA and they're not as stringent. But based on your opinion, are they promising?
So there are some trials that are like the Oxford vaccine. It's AstraZeneca. It has sites at different countries. It's the one that seems to be at a similar level, and if not a little bit more advanced. Obviously, with the stop that happened last week due to a possible adverse event, maybe it's a little bit more delayed. But that there are companies that are well known in pharmaceutical. There is also the Janssen vaccine. There is the so it's the Janssen, the AstraZeneca, Moderna, and there are certainly a lot of prestigious pharmaceutical companies working on vaccine development. As far as we know, there may be others for which, as you said, they are not FDA approved, and there may be companies that we are not so familiar with. And I think we'll have to wait and see. There are over 30 products that are under development. So that's a large number worldwide.
And
probably more.
Yeah, probably more. I mean, those are just the ones that we hear about. If something shows efficacy internationally, England, Russia, how hard is it to bring that to the US? Does the FDA has to, I'm sure, go through a very rigorous analysis of the data?
They do, and I think it depends on the country and depend on the regulatory agencies or where a vaccine is being approved. They do have ways of at least talking to each other and collaborating with each other to determine whether they can use how to use that data. Obviously, we really have to be sure, as much as we all want to have a vaccine that will work, and really fight this and end as soon as possible this pandemic, we also want to make sure that it's whatever product we choose is safe for the participants.
And so the FDA is obviously very notorious for being incredibly stringent. It's both a blessing and a curse. It makes sure that all the drugs are safe. But however, product development can take many, many years. With the pandemic, they have sped that process along.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the FDA has sped along this process, which is great for everyone?
Yes. So there are a couple of programs that have been developed very rapidly since the beginning of the pandemic. There is the coronavirus treatment acute program, so the CDAP, and there is also the Operation Rapid Speed. And this is kind of a mix of public as well as private-public partnership to really be able to accelerate the process. They are and really trying to make sure that whatever is available, as soon as it's shown it's efficacious, it can be moved and bring to the public and to the population as soon as possible. So there have been really big efforts since the beginning of the pandemic to ramp up and be able to really speed up any development of treatments, vaccine, as well as diagnostics.
Yeah, I mean, because it is kind of unprecedented to go from nothing to a vaccine in 1 year, as you can imagine. So clearly everyone's working to push this along. Can you tell us a little bit? I'm sorry, go on.
I was going to say it is unprecedented. It's unprecedented to have a pandemic, right? That there is, in history, there is a pandemic about every 100 years or so. I think it was time, but just because it happens it doesn't happen so often that we felt, or that everybody felt that maybe it was not going to happen, but it's definitely here, right? And I think as much as we think about really fighting complex diseases, really what's been dramatic here is kind of like an all-time pandemic that is really making crash the hospitals and the health service and really killing population all over the world. It's so everybody's working really fast, and I think that's good. It has put the scientific community to work together towards the common goal of ending this pandemic.
Now, what do you say about some of the media that talks about a vaccine in October, November? Because there has been a lot of talk about having it before the election. Obviously, a lot of this can be very political, and I don't want to get into that. But scientifically, realistically, is there any chance for a vaccine in the year 2020? It seems like no to me, but I want your opinion.
The way the trials have been designed, the requirement from the way the trials were designed was calling for later than November. I must say that some groups are really trying to work really hard to get results before that. For example, but nevertheless, most of the vaccines require 2 doses, which means an initial dose and then another dose a month later. So probably November will be extremely too early to have really valuable and scientific-based results on the efficacy. We also are now seeing a decrease in number of cases worldwide. I mean, not worldwide, but in the US, as other countries such as Europe are beginning to see the second wave. So I think, especially in the US, it will be certainly early to see a really difference in efficacy among the groups. I think science will talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as we wrap up here, I know that another big topic that is often talked about is the convalescent plasma. And that can be a treatment. Maybe just for the layperson, if you could just explain what convalescent plasma is and how it works.
Sure. So I think it's a perfect question after talking about the vaccine, because we already talked about how important it is to have antibodies. Antibodies is what really help to fight new viruses get in. So what convalescent plasma is the plasma. Plasma is the product of the blood that is like the liquid that doesn't include the cells. So it's full of antibodies. So what convalescent plasma is the plasma of a person after that person has recovered from COVID. And presumptively, that plasma has antibodies against COVID after they recover. Sorry. So what we do is we are using that plasma. We collect the plasma from somebody who's recovered from the infection and then administer to somebody who is sick in the hospital with infection. Or there are even trials looking at it for treatment for people who are not hospitalized, with the goal that those antibodies will actually be able to fight the virus. There has been a lot of programs, a lot of trials trying to look at the efficacy of convalescent plasma, and trials are ongoing. What we can say is that based on what is called expanded access approval, meaning give it to patients who were sick under an FDA approval to allow treatment for conditions for which we didn't have treatment, it showed that it was safe. And it shows that some promising results in terms of efficacy, but we don't have available results in terms of what we are talking about of a phase 3 clinical trial for convalescent plasma. But it is safe. It's used in the past for other infections, viral infections, and certainly it's something that we hope it will work at the moment, because we really have very few options that have obtained any type of approval. And even some of them were approved, and then the approval was revoked because trials showed that there was no efficacy.
Well, Dr. Alcaide, thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you. Obviously, you really are a true expert in this field. Thanks for all your hard work and your dedication. And, you know, it's really, I mean, the world is relying on you. You know, obviously, it's not much pressure, no pressure, but
it's been challenging times.
But it's fantastic the work you're doing. It's an amazing clinical trial. And like you said, I really hope that this gets wrapped up before the end of the year. And we really appreciate all your hard work and your colleagues as well, okay?
Thank you so much for having me.